I'm Abby, I have a lot of records, and this is Vinyl Monday. So welcome back, or welcome if this is your first time here. Vinyl Monday is the who, what, when, where, why, and how do I feel about classic albums in my collection. If TV show length episodes aren't your thing, don't worry. I also do Vinyl Monday in 60 seconds here on my channel, over on my Instagram, as well as TikTok. Okay, since I can't say this album's title in the first 2 minutes of this video, lest the YouTube terms of service gods smite me, we have some waffling to do. Good thing I have announcements to make. Starting with the reg. The new episode of the Dolls Pod is up now. We tell the story of artist, actress, muse to Salvador Dali, and one of the first black supermodels, Donyal Luna. Though she was the first black woman on a cover of Vogue, she's been largely forgotten by fashion history. Donyal and her story are endlessly fascinating. The Dolls Podcast is available wherever you stream your podcasts, but as always, Apple and Spotify are linked in the description. Second on the docket, have you ever wondered what I listen to in my free time? Do I have some news for you? I am now on Spun It, where you can sync up your Discogs collections, share your recent listens with the world, rate them. You can even give them witty little one-sentence reviews. Vinyl-inclined fans of Goodreads or Letterboxd, this app is for you. I have not been paid to plug this. I'm just really excited that this exists. You can find Spun It for free on your app store, and you can find me on Spun It as Abigail DeVoe. If my math is right, my 2 minutes should be up in approximately now. This week's album is Miles Davis, Bitches Brew. Congrats if you guessed this one. Remember, if you want to play along, all you gotta do is check out my posts tab. That's never gonna feel normal. That's where I post hints to what the next album is gonna be. I make announcements, I host polls. You can find all of that on my channel. And if you so choose, you can always read the written versions of my reviews on my website, abigaildevoe.com. Yeah, that's the third announcement, and probably the biggest. I'm at a new domain. Through a series of long and really confusing and honestly unfortunate circumstances, congratulations to me, I guess, I was able to buy abigaildevoe.com, and that's linked in the description. You viewers are always asking how you can support me. This is the closest thing. Subscribing to and engaging with my mailing list is completely free, and it helps me more than you could know, especially as we make this real-life Layla Abigail DeVoe transition. Alright, enough announcements for one day. Let's take the plastic off. So my copy of Bitches Brew is a repress from the UK. Since these are the orange and yellow CBS labels, we can safely estimate this was issued sometime between the mid-70s and early 80s. Now let's talk about this cover art. If this style looks familiar to you, it's because it is. We have a return appearance from painter Mati Klarwein. Whatever energy was in the air in 1970, it was perfectly suited to his eclectic style. This guy was on a roll. His paintings were on a ton of book covers, and his piece Annunciation was on, gotta be careful with this one, the cover of Santana's Abraxas that year. Mati was also working on the cover for a planned Gil Evans-Jimi Hendrix album, but Jimmy passed before they could record it. This is probably Mati's most famous work. Mati had a great sense of color and texture. This combo of bright blue, yellow, pink, and dark brown is instantly recognizable. Day and night, light and dark are split down the spine. B-roll Abby will be showing you much better than I could. The foreground blends into the background. This woman's hair becomes the storm over the ocean. A flaming flower becomes the sky. The back cover is suspended in the cosmos, these hands with interlocked fingers becoming a pale, freckled face. I've also heard these droplets are either sweat or blood. We also have a Wodabe dancer. Mati painted these pretty often in this period of his career. They're also on the Abraxas cover. They're kind of like his signature. We don't know where or when Miles first saw this painting, but Mati did talk about their first meeting in an interview in the 90s. Quote, "First, he came to my temple, and he said he wanted to buy. the painting. He asked the price, but I think he was only joking. He told me to come and visit him because he wanted the painting for the cover of Bitches Brew. So Monty went to Miles's home in New York. It was pretty far out, to say the least, even for a guy with a studio decorated like a temple. Miles disappeared into his bedroom with a girl, but before abandoning him, he put on the record for Monty. 20 years later, they met at a party, and first thing, Miles is like, "Where's my painting?" No dice. Monty sold it to someone else. Opening up the gatefold, we see Miles chillin' on vacation in the studio, flanked by liner notes by Ralph Gleason of the San Francisco Chronicle. On Bitches Brew, we have the man of the hour, band leader Miles Davis, obviously playing the trumpet. He's backed by Wayne Shorter on saxophone. He also wrote Sanctuary. Benny Maupin on bass clarinet, Chick Corea, Larry Young, and Joe Zawinul on keys, Dave Holland on double bass, Don Alias on congas, and Jack DeJohnette and Lenny White on drums. We also have Airto Moreira and Jim Riley on other percussion, Harvey Brooks on bass guitar, and playing guitar, the one, the only, John McLaughlin. Bitches Brew was produced by Teo Macero. Roll transition. If you were to take any one of Miles Davis's albums and just delete them from music history, you're not just fucking up jazz history, you're fucking up rock and roll history. Miles's connections to rock go back way before his fusion arc. Sketches of Spain inspired Grace Slick to write White Rabbit, and Miles springboarded the careers of many of the greats, including John Coltrane. Without him, 8 Miles High and all subsequent psych rock just wouldn't exist. Come the late 1960s, Miles noticed that young white groups on Columbia, notably Blood, Sweat and Tears and Chicago, were getting preferential treatment to the jazz acts, where Kind of Blues sold hundreds of thousands of copies alone. Miles's mid-60s stretch averaged about 50,000 copies per album. Columbia was not a fan of this, or the infinite money hack in Miles's contract. Well, it wasn't quite an infinite money hack, but he could ask for advances against royalties earned, meaning whenever he needed cash, he could just call up Columbia and get an advance. The label felt Miles wasn't selling enough to warrant this privilege, but there really wasn't anything they could do about it. Miles noticed the winds changing. Quote, "Jazz seemed to be withering on the vine, in record sales and live performances. It was the first time in a long time that I didn't sell out crowds wherever I played. We played a lot of half-empty clubs in 1969. That told me something." Later, quote, "I started realizing that most rock musicians didn't know anything about music. I figured if they could do it, sell all those records without really knowing what they were doing, I could do it too. Only better." Miles's sonic shift wasn't a cash grab, though. It was authentic to his taste. He listened to Sly and the Family Stone, The Electric Flag, even The Fifth Dimension. He was a sponge. Like any artist, he picked up influences from those around him. Producer Teo Macero was a huge influence. This guy's resume is nuts. Mingus and Time Out on top of like all of Miles's Columbia output. Teo knew Edgar Varese from Juilliard and got Miles hip to his stuff. He also got Miles hip to electric equipment. Teo gave his group their first 2 Fender Rhodeses. Chick Corea somehow broke them both. We can't count out the influence of Miles's wife Betty Davis, or ex-wife. A funk icon in her own right, Betty was 18 years younger than Miles. She got him dressing in African-inspired clothing, took him to new clubs like Ungano's, where he saw that infamous Stooges gig where Iggy slammed his dick on the amp. Miles had 2 girlfriends at the same time after Betty. Both were hip with the times and quite spiritual. Carlos Santana thinks this album's title is named after them. Of course, there's the Jimi Hendrix of it all. Miles really wanted to work with him. He was introduced to Jimmy through John McLaughlin. Though he's not the Mahavishnu yet, I think he's just released or is about to release Extrapolation. John had played with 2/3 of Cream in the Graham Bond organization and was the only guitarist to freak Frank Zappa out. Dave Holland brought Miles to see John and Larry Young playing with the Tony Williams Lifetime. As John said, "Miles had never seen Jimmy, so I took took him to this art movie theater downtown to see the film Monterey Pop, where Jimmy ended by squirting lighter fluid on his guitar, setting it on fire. Miles was next to me, saying, "Fuck." He was enchanted. And of course, the drugs. Monty Clarwine described visiting Miles's home and seeing an 8-inch bowl of cocaine just chilling on the table. In 1967, Miles was taking his live recordings and cutting the breaks between songs to make one long medley. Fine. He brought that into the studio with Circle in the Round in December. Now that was blasphemous. Columbia didn't release that for 12 years, but you do hear edited stuff like this on Miles in the Sky in '68. So we've covered the recording methods. With Feed to Kilimanjaro, the fusion sound begins. Tony Williams introduced Miles to Chick Corea, and Dave Holland joins the band. When it came time to record the next, Miles brought this group into the studio. Cannonball Adderley alum Joe Zawinul joins at the last minute, bringing his composition In a Silent Way with him. Along came In a Silent Way. But now, recording didn't stop and start. The band did. According to Teo Macero, quote, "Everything that's done in the studio is recorded, so you've got a fantastic collection of everything done in the studio. I just pull out what I want, copy what I want, and then the original goes back into the vaults untouched. So whoever doesn't like what I did, 20 years from now, they can go back and redo it." Miles's sketch method, plus the obvious edits, plus the nod to rock and roll, was cataclysmic, and people did not like it. Martin Williams for the New York Times alleged a faulty edit that inadvertently repeated a stretch of music. Rich. The Bitches Brew group morphed together through the Lost Quintet, active in the 6 months between Silent Way and this. About that quintet, Miles said, quote, "Man, I wish this band had recorded live, because it really was a bad motherfucker." This group played Spanish Key, Miles Runs the Voodoo Down, and Sanctuary. The latter is the oldest song here. It was recorded by Miles' second great quartet, but was shelved. There's a lot more guys in the fray now. Like Larry Young and bassist Harvey Brooks, they helped Miles record Betty Davis's first album. Jack DeJohnette had, quote, "a certain deep groove that Miles liked." He recommended bass clarinetist Bernie Maupin. Lenny White is the youngest guy here. He's only 19. He was recommended to Miles by Jackie McLean. Tony Williams introduced Miles to Don Alias, who brought his buddy Jim Riley in. Airto played in Cannonball Adderley's group with Joe Zawinul. In time, the Bitches Brew group swells to 13 guys, 3 keyboardists, 2 bassists, and 4 drummers and percussionists. Columbia was booked for August 19th, 20th, and 21st of 1969. It's crazy to think that the day after Woodstock wrapped, Miles Davis is recording this. Contrary to popular belief, there was some preparation. Joe brought a few songs into Miles. He picked Pharaoh's Dance. The Bitches Brew sessions were really short, starting no later than 10 o'clock in the morning and running no later than 1 in the afternoon. Jack DeJohnette remembers, quote, "a stream of creative musical energy. One thing was flowing into the next, and we were stopping and starting all the time, maybe to write a sketch out, and then go back to recording. The creative process was being documented on tape, with Miles directing the ensemble like a conductor of an orchestra." Bitches Brew sessions produced 9 hours of material, 94 minutes of which we hear on the record. A lot of changes happened in that time. Teo cut stuff, rearranged things, repeated sections. He used delay, echo, and reverb chambers. He's using the studio as an instrument, and none of the guys are aware of what they were going for or what the final product would be. Miles didn't let any of the guys hear the music in the moment. If they did, they'd find perceived flaws and psych themselves out. The energy would be gone.
I don't think he was aware what really went on in the editing, because a lot of musicians used to tell me they would hear the stuff on the radio and they would say, who the hell is that? And somebody said, well, that's Miles's last record. Guy said, I was on that record. Is that what we did?
And that's exactly what happened to Benny. He didn't know what his own music sounded like until he heard it on the car radio. Hearing it was, quote, like being in a dream where you're hearing music but you can't figure it out and it's just driving you crazy. After maybe 10 minutes, the host for the show announced that it was the new Miles Davis recording. Oh my god, I almost forgot about the title. This is the best part. Okay, so on November 3rd, 1969, Teo sends out a memo about this new Miles Davis album. It's a single LP, it's called Listen to This, and it's got 2 songs on it. Pharaoh's Dance and Bitches Brew. 11 days later, Teo sends out a second memo. Maybe the most famous memo in all of music history. And I quote, Miles just called and said he wants his album to be titled Bitches Brew. Please advise. Yes, Bitches Brew technically is a full sentence. There are bitches and they brew. The track listing of Bitches Brew goes as follows. Opening up disc 1, we have Pharaoh's Dance, and closing disc 1, we have Bitches Brew. Opening up disc 2, we have Spanish Key. Closing side 3, we have John McLaughlin. Opening up side 4, we have Miles Runs the Voodoo Down, and the album closes with Sanctuary. Bitches Brew was released either late March or early April 1970. Man, I'm jumping the gun on 55th anniversaries this season. And this lineup was already done. Wayne Shorter left in late 69. Miles alleges in his book that Bitches Brew was the fastest selling jazz album in history. It sold 500,000 copies on release, very good for a jazz LP at the time, and was certified platinum in the 2000s. Columbia ordered a single. In response, Teo harvested as much as he could from Spanish Key and Miles Runs the Voodoo Down and just slapped him on a disc. Of course, there was pre-existing controversy surrounding Miles going electric. Quote, rock critics thought In a Silent Way sounded like rock, or at least thought Miles was nodding in their direction, and practically wet themselves with joy. Jazz critics, especially ones who didn't listen to much rock, thought it sounded like rock too, and they reacted less favorably. Less favorably? By the time Bitches Brew came out, the elitist snobs of the bunch were pissed. They accused Miles of selling out by turning to rock sounds. The grudge lasted for decades. Stanley Crouch exercised his truly bizarre fixation on Bitches Brew in the 90s with his essay, Play the Right Thing. It's important to note that Miles himself never saw Bitches Brew as remotely near rock. When accused of hiring a rock guitarist, John McLaughlin, he rightly answered, I didn't use John as a rock player. John's no more a rock player than I am a rock trumpet player. While yes, Rolling Stone did review Bitches Brew, I think we'd all agree Downbeat would be more relevant today, right? James Santor reviewed Bitches Brew in the June 11th, 1970 issue. He was just left in awe. He could hardly describe what he'd heard. In fact, he refused to. Quote, I really don't want to count the musical cracks on this sidewalk. I'd rather trip over them. Fissures, peaks, plateaus, anguish, strange beauty. It's all there for a reason, and it can be torn up for a reason. He names Benny and John McLaughlin as the MVPs, praised Wayne Shorter's solos on Spanish Key and Voodoo Down, and names Sanctuary Miles' standout moment. After Bitches Brew, Miles' standing with Columbia was completely turned on its head. Like he gave a shit. They put him in contact with Bill Graham and landed him gigs at the Fillmore with the Grateful Dead. He played Tanglewood with Santana. He played Isle of Wight that year too. This was a jazz album that sold to young white people. The demographic the whole music industry was geared toward in 1970. Echoes of this stuff can be heard in Miles's last few studio albums before retirement, my personal favorite of the bunch being Pangea.
Miss Mitch don't know about Pangea.
Oh. Can you tell I went to college in 2017? Yeah, it goes without saying Bitches Brew's legacy is immense, huge as the music itself. This ensemble splintered off and authored our modern understanding of fusion. Joe Zawinul, Wayne Shorter, and Airto Moreira played as Weather Report. Bernie Maupin played Mwandishi with Herbie Hancock. Chick Corea played in Return to Forever with Lenny White, and of course, John McLaughlin form the Mahavishnu Orchestra. So, what do I think of Bitches Brew? Right off the bat, this is gonna be a different review for me. For one, jazz is some technical shit. I will only be referencing super basic technical stuff when I absolutely must. I know when key changes happen and when meter changes, but I don't always know what it's changing to and from. All that extra helpful stuff will be... Oh, I still have my notes in here, sorry. I have a college degree and I can't figure out how the sticky note comes up. Ah, there we go. That will all come from George Grella's 33 1/3 on Bitches Brew. I will also be mentioning timestamps 100% more than usual. We don't have my usual markers of when things happen in songs, like lyrics or changes from verse to chorus. Having those timestamps will be helpful for you viewers to know what I'm hearing, especially with all the edits. Going in, the only album I've covered even close to Bitches Brew's magnitude is goddamn Trout Mask Replica. It's my only previous context for bass clarinet. My muscle memory with this instrument is fucked now. In spite of itself, I could understand how Trout Mask was organized. A man who could not play the piano, banging parts out on the piano, and holding his band hostage till they transcribed it and played it to perfection. True story. But I could not understand how Bitches Brew was organized until I learned how it was made. Miles and Teo were taking bits and bobs from longer exercises and cutting them up to make full pieces in post. In a way, it was sampling. The composition and recording of Bitches Brew was loose but tight, as Miles described. No one truly knew what the final product would sound like, not even the main man. It was creation after creation. There is a method to Brew's madness. The fact that 3 keyboardists and 2 drummers can play at the same time and not fall apart is proof. In the Rolling Stone review, Langdon Winner said, quote, "Whatever your temperament, Bitches Brew will reward in direct proportion to the depth of your own involvement. You have to be committed to this. There's constant ebb and flow between tension and relative release. Upon first listen, you'll be hard-pressed to find a groove to speak of, but after a few listens, you can pick the grooves out. I find the grooves better in passive listening, while I'm reading or transcribing notes, rather than actively listening to take notes. This album is proof that genre isn't defined by what instruments are on a record, it's how they're used. It's not the input, it's the output. But with the same input, we have 2 pretty different outputs across both discs. One is foreboding, spooky, anxious, a lot more out there. The other disc is a lot closer to the fusion title. The guys slammed as much music as was physically possible on the first disc. Having quite literally no time to waste makes for an abrupt opening. The first we hear of Bitches Brew is Jack DeJohnette, playing quarter notes on the snare and eighth notes on the hi-hat. It's the anxious opening of Pharaoh's Dance. It's interesting to note that the thesis statement of this record was recorded on the last day. One of my favorite moments on the whole album are Benny's quizzical, zigzagging honks. It's curious, like an animal sniffing around on the ground. This agitated feeling is enforced by many edits in a short time. Some are obvious, some not. 7 of Pharaoh's 19 edits happen before Miles even comes in. They form an A-B-C structure, setting up what must be the groove of the song, right? It's a false sense of security before throwing us into the dense landscape of Pharaoh's Dance. Miles comes in for only a brief moment, testing the water before dropping out. He lets the band simmer on that groove a minute longer, sauntering in and spatting about in accented shakes and squeaks. It is quickly apparent that Bitches Brew will place greater value on rhythm, mood, and texture than melody versus harmony or a linear progression of a song. Note the claustrophobic quaking everyone locks into at 6 minutes 45 seconds. Once you find your place in this instrumental corkscrew, it's far less chaotic. It's this African-inspired dark groove. This song also establishes looping, a 1 second long fragment that first appears appears at 8 minutes and 39 seconds, is repeated 5 times. A very obvious splice and a heavily echoplex trumpet line take us into the next movement of Pharaoh. The two halves of this song are connected by the motif Chick is riffing on. Harvey lurches in on bass. Benny's panicked interjections are reminiscent of the Rite of Spring. After like 12 minutes, Miles finally sets Pharaoh's true central theme. I never thought any of Bitches Brew would be remotely singable, but there are licks here and there, bits and bobs I walk around with in my head. The musical Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, like the record revolving on the turntable. On the other side of disc 1 is the title track, the first piece of music recorded, and it's the darkest one here. The strongest and most memorable thing about Bitches Brew the song is its exposition. It's the most unsettling moment on the whole record. We have the thumping heart palpitation entrance of Dave and Harvey like a dim flickering light, then a dissonant chord. Miles' siren calls out into the night to wake the beasts. The drums roll, keys play insistent chords. This is blaring loud on my copy. It echoes and pans across your head, and it's disorienting as hell if you're not expecting it. Swinging tentatively between C major, C minor, and A flat major. Having that over our bizarre three-footed march is quite a pungent flavor. There are 15 edits in this track and 3 loops of the same 5 seconds starting at 3 minutes and 1 second in. I am so glad that George Grella mentioned the space between 2 discs in his analysis of Bitches Brew. I've been squawking about this since Dark Side and I was starting to feel crazy. It's nice to know that another writer saw it important. It gives a necessary pause to digest what we just experienced. Disc 2 opens with Spanish Key. I've heard this described as a 1970 modernization of flamenco sketches. And also a nod to Sketches of Spain, where flamenco is contemplative and smoky. Spanish Key hauls ass. That's indicative of the guys playing this on the road for months. This is the piece they're most confident with. It's loaded to the brim with players. This is one of those tracks where you really have to keep track of who's playing and what channel. And again, we have a strong emphasis on rhythm and texture. A funky, scratchy rhythm guitar by John and a front-heavy tempo. Dave puts weight on the 1, 2, and 3. Miles muddies that by coming in on the 4th beat and shouldering his way from E to D. It feels wrong, but it's definitely not. There's a trippy moment where the 2 drummers fall out of sync. Jack holds the 1, 2, 3 emphasis, but Lenny rubber bands it out, hitting the 4th with the same emphasis. There's a dizzying solo by Miles, crazy runs that totally indulge in the fun. I don't think of anything particularly high, loud, or fast when I think of his playing style, so this was a surprise. Chick punches the song up to G major with this line at 3 minutes 12 seconds. It's like a shot directly to the heart. It cuts Miles' solo in 2. It's repeated a few times as the turnaround of the track, kind of like a checkpoint. The first time around, this new bright key mellows Miles out. He eventually drops out for a fun John and Chick duet. This might be a better John McLaughlin showcase than John McLaughlin. He's dexterous on the attack. Lenny White is pushed up in the mix. His syncopation makes what John's doing all the more exciting. As for the editing in Spanish Key, it's pretty chill, except 2 edits within 1 second. This is the most chaotic choice on the whole album. It plucks us out of this rock-edged moment and into Wayne Shorter's solo. Spanish Key waves in and out of G. It drifts through E and D for that back and forth between Chick and John. A very elastic approach to the key changes the color of the track. It's funky, exotic, quirky. Chick mashes on weird chords just for the hell of it. Ooh, yeah, that's probably how he broke 2 Fender Rhodes. There's a spine-tingling moment where everyone pulls back for just a few spacey seconds. Miles produces intense swizzling motions echoed by John, slowly creeping up into a wash of sound. I was an idiot for not knowing John McLaughlin was on this album sooner. There's literally a track called John McLaughlin, but But you can't hold that against me. I first heard Bitches Brew in college while, like, close to blackout drunk. John McLaughlin is the shortest track on the album, and it was pulled from the title track, originally intended to be part 3 of a 5-part suite. I would love to hear what the full 5 parts were supposed to sound like together. This feels disconnected from the rest of Bitches Brew's world. It's low-key and measured in feel, with its clustered and calm central chick motif coming in from the right. It feels like less people on this song, and that's because there are. Miles and Wayne sat this one out. If anything, John McLaughlin reminds me of the sense of play that went into recording Bitches Brew, and it's a nice tribute to the Sidemen. Miles Runs the Voodoo Down was the only new music on disc 2. Sanctuary, Spanish Key, and McLaughlin, as a part of Bitches Brew, were all in the repertoire. Where John McLaughlin felt like an interlude, Voodoo Down feels like the true come down from Spanish Key. If I had to introduce a new listener to Bitches Brew, I would start here, purely for this being the most normal of the bunch. It's more mellow than the iterations the group played live. It builds with a quiet intensity via garbled statements from Chick and Joe Zawinul. This is the coolest bass line on the whole album, boosted by Dave and Harvey doubling up on bass guitar. They dictate this steady groove for basically the whole thing, even after an edit splices 2 takes together. It only ends when those two drop the groove. It's a pretty ending. The bass just falls out gently, the percussion shakes lightly and is set down. Once again, this is a better showcase for John McLaughlin than John McLaughlin. His solo from about 4 minutes and 30 seconds on makes ample use of his signature short and agile phrases. It's a treat to hear his style evolve among the 3 projects I know him from. On this disc of Bitches Brew, he's a player standing at the edge of one dimension, staring into the horizon and making grasps at the next. Grella argues in his book that Bitches Brew never comes to an organic end. It's only ended by the physical limitations of the vinyl format. I disagree. Bitches Brew closes with Wayne Shorter's composition Sanctuary. There is some drama overwriting credits for this one. It's an expressive tune with bursts of lyrical contributions by Miles. Lyrical in playing, not in, like, lyrics. We've covered pretty much the whole spectrum of Miles' style in these 90-some-odd minutes, from the restraint he exercised in the Kind of Blue days to blaring, delightful show-offery. However, I was most struck by its false ending. Sanctuary comes to a logical conclusion, at least in my brain, at about 5 minutes 40 seconds. An extended note over a cymbal wash followed by a blink and you'll miss it silence, because then it just resumes. We're brought to the end of the path, and then the path resumes in the next dimension. It looks different, but by touch, if we get down and feel the sand, it's the same. That's the magic of Bitches Brew. Upon concluding this second, more palatable disc, I'm struck by how beautifully Bitches Brew is structured. It forms a perfect arc, a bizarre climax by Pharaoh's Dance and the title track, the apex at Spanish Key, the come down of Voodoo Down, and resolution in Sanctuary. John McLaughlin is our B-plot, our thank you to the side characters. But they don't feel like side characters. Bitches Brew doesn't feel like a Miles Davis the Principal Player album, or even a trumpet album. It's a meeting of the minds. Bitches Brew is the #1 thing I love about jazz. I love that there's no set end goal. It's about the journey. That's a marker of genius, always wanting to find the next thing. Since the release of Questlove's second film, I've been thinking about the concept of black genius. Sly Stone, Jimi Hendrix, Prince, Quincy Jones, Stevie Wonder. When I think of the definition of genius, the compulsion to create and evolve, that is Miles Davis. He always had that urge for metamorphosis, and Joe Grella backed me up on this. Quote, "The last gig, the last record, the last style, the music that all other musicians were playing. That was all yesterday. He had done that. It didn't make sense to do it again. There was a constant journey toward the unadorned essence of his music. That quality was just one more record or one sound away. Monty Klarwein thought Miles was the Picasso of jazz. So did Grella in the first 10 pages of his book. I think of Bitches Brew as a peak Salvador Dali. Masculine, twisting, melting, with a broad, wide horizon, shaded and earthy color palette, plays with sense of time, blurs foreground and background, sometimes ugly, sometimes controversial, deeply revered. In a 1970 Downbeat piece, Dan Morgenstern said, quote, "In jazz today, there are many seekers of new ways. Often, the searching feels forced and the results not natural. Miles Davis, however, has that rare gift of being able to give birth and life to new things, which, no matter how startling, always seem natural and logical, and open up new roads for others to travel after he has moved on. Bitches Brew still intimidates today. It's still some of the most dense, out-of-the-box music ever pressed to wax. Depending on the listener you are and the context you have before wandering into this, it can be terrifying, but you can't wander into Bitches Brew. You have to dive in. Not consciously, though, and you have to shut your eyes and dive in. It'll overload your senses, but you can coexist with it. Live with it in the background for 5 weeks. Shut yourself in a room with incense to feel that trance state power. Bitches Brew is powerful, deep, and dark. I have climbed in, and after those first couple listens, every time I had to climb out, I was reluctant to. Bitches Brew is the whole. Now get lost. My personal favorites off this one are Pharaoh's Dance, Bitches Brew, Spanish Key, and Miles Runs the Voodoo Down. Remember, if you want to hear all of my favorites from all of the Vinyl Mondays, I have a Spotify playlist linked in my description. I update it every week. And that's it! That was the last episode of a weekly Vinyl Monday. After this, my scheduling change kicks in. I will be 3 weeks on, 1 week off, and next week is my off week. What a way to end that arc. 3.5 years almost of weekly episodes, and man, I'm tired. With this show and my website and my podcast, it's a lot. If we're gonna uphold this quality of work, then something's gotta give. But what do you think of this album? What do you think of Miles Davis? Leave a comment letting me know. I love hearing what you guys have to say about albums that I love. And remember, despite what some guy on the internet says, your opinion matters. If you like what I do here, you should like this video and subscribe to my channel. I post new episodes of Vinyl Monday, Monday mornings at 11, and a new episode of the Dolls podcast every other Friday at noon. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!